Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Anthropocene Institute webinar, Learn What People Really Think About Nuclear Energy. We'll be starting in just a minute, but while we wait for everybody to join, I'd like to invite you to participate in a quick audience poll. It should pop up on your screen any moment now. Simply choose the answer you think is right. And we'll find out later what most of you have voted. But for now, let's get started. Again, this is Learn What People Really Think About Nuclear Energy. I'm Angelica Ong, a clean energy advocate based in Taiwan, and your moderator for this webcast. Nuclear energy can't move forward without public support. But until recently, we lacked a comprehensive understanding of what people across the globe truly think. That's where PACE, the Public Acceptance of Clean Energy Survey, comes in. It's the largest survey ever conducted on public opinions about nuclear energy. PACE covers 20 different countries, surveying over 20,000 people with 55 questions each, yielding over 1 million data points. There's a wealth of insights here on how attitude towards nuclear energy vary by age, income, geography, gender, environmental involvement, and even political affiliation. Today, we're really fortunate to have with us Mark Nelson. Say hi, Mark. And Rich Allington from the Radiant Energy Group. Mark is one of the world's leading pro-nuclear voices, and this survey is Rich's brainchild. First of all, we have Mark Nelson with us from the Radiant Energy Group. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Thanks for having us.
And Mark is coming to us from Chicago, and Rich?
From London. Pleasure to be here.
Well, wonderful. Well, I'm really excited to just dive into this discussion. So if everybody has voted, we can get going. Mike, how are we looking for the voting?
Yes, we have about 33 people that have voted.
Great. All right. I'm going to give you guys just another minute to vote. And when we have about 50 results, we're going to reveal what's going on. But while we're giving our audience a moment to keep voting, Rich, you're the one that came up with this idea of doing a poll of nuclear attitudes. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're hoping to find out and how you got started with this project?
Well, the whole idea started when I was reading through the IPCC report and other reports on nuclear energy, and time again, they would say nuclear is great, but it doesn't have the public support. And I wanted to question this and find the data, and I found it really frustrating. Every country had their own poll. The polls weren't always regular. The questions definitely weren't comparable across countries. And there was no way to benchmark that nuclear support versus other clean energies that these environmental groups were putting forward, like renewable biomass and gas with carbon capture. So Mark and I wanted a way to be able to benchmark public support across energies, across time, and across countries, so that we can get that easy to use data point to instruct institutions on what to do about nuclear, how to improve public support, whether they should invest in it or not.
Because
decisions to be made.
Sorry, Rich, just wanted to jump in. This is not we're not trying to find out that nuclear is extremely popular and therefore everyone should be for nuclear. This was to benchmark actually how unpopular as well as how popular it was. We were not expecting, I think, to find good news in every country. And indeed, from the perspective of those of us who are professionals in nuclear and like the field and chose it for its environmental and social qualities, we weren't expecting to find only good news. We did not only find good news. I think that one of the problems that Rich didn't mention is that some of this polling has been done privately with the data only for internal use, never released. What we wanted is if we found really negative information about people just hating nuclear energy, we're going to release it anyway. And that's a little bit difficult for some polling efforts that are funded by industry trade bodies or that don't have the independence to just get out there. For us, we intended it from day one to be a resource for the public, to be a resource for people to know themselves in their own country, and also for journalists who wanted something that obviously we've got to build trust and show how we conducted the polling, how the questions and the process were done to highest professional standards. So we've had to build that trust, but it was intended to be a source for journalists, especially when comparing against the claims of industry.
Great. Well, what I'm hearing is that this is a mission for truth and a way to benchmark our priors. And talking about benchmarking, we've had plenty of time to let everybody vote. So, Mike, can you show us the results for the question? All right, so for everybody, what share of global respondents see nuclear energy as creating a fair amount or a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions? And it obviously, there's a range of results, and I won't read them all out. We can see them all on the screen. But Rich, would you tell us what is the actual result?
Yeah, so the actual result is it's around 50% of the public around the world see nuclear as emitting somewhat amount of emissions. So higher than what most of you think. And what we find is that's one of the main drivers of why people are anti-nuclear. They don't appreciate it as the low emission source that it is.
Yeah, well, I almost see that as a glass half full, glass half empty kind of result, right? It's almost 50%. I'm actually glad that at least half the people polled actually realize that nuclear is low carbon. Mark, what do you think? Was this in line with what you expected, or what does this information give us?
So one of the difficulties about polling is, let's call it a theory of mind, not to get way too weird in just the first 10 minutes, but I think anyone dialing in to listen to me is expecting something like that. You have to get a feeling of what a person is thinking at different walks of life, different stages of life, different wealth and income levels. What are they going to think and how are they going to interpret your question? That's, the answer is downstream of that. And one of the things we wanted was to make sure that we didn't have preconceived notion of what the results would be. We had such an interesting experience with this poll, and Rich may be able to expand, making one of the few things where we had to go back and look at our methodology and try to decide whether we were representing what we were seeking from people well. But I'll tell you, anecdotally, the word is out there among those who care about carbon. Nuclear has emissions. Now, we might say, no, isn't it the opposite? Most people are getting the word that nuclear doesn't have emissions. That's called living in a bubble, and nothing reveals it quite so well as here. If we were sitting down with all 20,000 people all over planet Earth that answered this question, we could maybe say, what do you mean when you said a lot of carbon? Is that like a lot like coal? Is it a lot like but since we were asking against other technologies, we were kind of slapped in the face by the fact that as much as we in the nuclear world think we've gotten the message out that nuclear is extremely low carbon, it's just not there intuitively at the level of information that even pro-nuclear nations have. Or at least it's not a totally dominant point of view, and many respondents have never heard it, even when they support nuclear despite thinking that it causes emissions.
Well, that also brings us to a very fascinating point we'll come to. I just want to draw everybody to the fact that I put the emissions from nuclear energy seen as high by the majority graphic from the PACE report, and you can see the breakdown by the countries, and it's fascinating comparing Japan Russia with pretty good knowledge, and the Philippines and Brazil right at the bottom there. And that's concerning because Brazil is going to be hosting the COP after this one. But yeah, to your point, Mark, which is that people support nuclear energy sometimes even when they still have all sorts of concerns about it. This is this fascinating graphic that I want to talk about. What can you
And yeah,
um,
this is I'm gonna let Rich go for it, but this thing,
Rich?
if I just
Yeah.
got one slide to sit there and stare at and think about in my about my 8 years of travel and work, you could call it the anthropology in the field of chatting people up about nuclear energy. This is the one I go back to out of our survey, and it will be absolutely fascinating to see how this changes in future polls. But I had to sit with this one for a bit. Rich, take it away.
To explain this, around the world, across the 20 countries that we surveyed, 79%, so 4 out of every 5 people are concerned about nuclear safety. That's kind of what everyone expects. Everyone knows that nuclear has got this public perception issue around safety. But what's really interesting is how much of an issue that is. So of those 4/5 of people that are concerned about nuclear safety, there's still more people supporting nuclear use than opposing it. So on the support side, 40% versus opposing 33%. So what this tells us is obviously views on whether nuclear is safe or not are somewhat important, but they're not the be all and end all because there's still a majority of people who are worried about nuclear safety that still support it. People care about the other aspects of nuclear, or the other aspects of nuclear allow people to support it, even though they are concerned about safety. What we
Yeah.
found is reliability, and as mentioned earlier, like views on whether nuclear is clean or not. Those have a much greater bearing on whether people are supportive of nuclear.
Well, that's a really great display of pragmatism because I think the pro and anti-nuclear debate can be so polarized online. It seems like everybody's 100% pro or against it, but this is a fascinating window into how people actually think, and people are actually tremendously pragmatic, is what we're seeing um, in how they make their decisions on whether or not to support nuclear. I think that
On
Angelica,
that safety question, oh, go on, Mark.
sure. I was going to say, if we had, again, access to interview in person in the native language of choice of 20,000 different people, I might ask things on this. When you say concerns, do you mean, do you have fear? Do you experience the emotion of fear when you think about waste or when you think about, and we'd run through the different topics. And I would imagine that part of what we're viewing here is that people either are concerned, but below the level of fear, or are not afraid at all, but are
Mhm.
showing they've considered or thought about or heard about those issues involved in nuclear energy. And to answer, no, I'm not concerned, might be to sound churlish or antisocial, like you don't care at all about a technology that produces waste. Who would say they don't worry about waste? Now, I could get an interpretation where that makes sense, but what we're clearly seeing is that people have heard of those issues and do care about those issues, while on balance still finding their way to supporting nuclear energy's use overall.
I love it. It gives us a push pull to work on people. We can load people up on the benefits of nuclear power and educating them on that and how it's low carbon and everything. At the same time, we can also educate them on how it's the things that they're worried about maybe are not so much of a concern, and trust them to come up with their own judgment.
Well,
On,
Angelica, one note on that. Sorry to interrupt. You used push pull and you used PUSH PULL. I
yeah.
winced a little bit because one of the accusations that's been thrown at Richard and myself is that we've run a push poll. That is a
Oh, yes.
PUSHPOLL, which is a
Oh,
word
yes.
from American political culture where you run a poll that says, "Do you hate your nation and therefore are going to vote for the other guy? Yes or no?" Or are you accountable? Are you going to stand up and support your team? Yes or no? And it's not the point of a push poll is not to actually get results. The point is to induce a change of mind or shame into doing some action. In our case, we've been told, oh, this poll isn't reliable because you two like nuclear energy, or because Radiant Energy Group has clients in the nuclear energy space, or something like that, where uh, I would say that I wasn't keen about this poll because I thought it would help us educate the public. I know that's of interest to Rich. I already work on trying to educate the public. That is a laboratory for me all day, every day. This poll was to educate the industry for me. That was the
Oh,
biggest
interesting.
goal. And so people are like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you're trying to influence the public. Well, kind of. I would like reporters to be able to cram these numbers down the face of industry leaders and the finance community that has to deal with what they believe about the public in order to decide whether to endorse or not endorse a nuclear program.
Well, I think this is a very good time for Rich to come in briefly about the methodology and who you work with to make sure that this poll is up to snuff when it comes to impartiality.
Yeah, so we don't run the poll. We work with an external polling agency, and they go country to country, and they get 1,000 respondents per country. Those respondents are motivated to answer the poll with a little gift card on Amazon or something. And so they're all online respondents. The polling agency gets their 1,000 respondents and they make sure that they get an even mix for that country based on gender splits, age splits, and regional splits. And then once they get the survey results in, they do a round of quality control. So they make sure that the survey wasn't answered in record time, that when there was an open text question, that the text actually made sense. It wasn't just a computer AI bot that had answered it. And then there's also another layer that we're adding on where they can compare answers and make sure there's consistency across the survey responses. So there's a lot of checks that go through, and those are industry norms.
Great. Well, let's
And
see
despite that, it's not, no poll is ever going to be perfect unless
of
somehow
course.
you were sitting down with every single person. I found a few little oddities. I went through, no, I didn't go through every single one of 20,000 lines, but when we got the results in, I was down digging as deep as possible in the data to try to figure out, could we really have gotten this gold mine of data? Is it really true? And sure enough, I found things that may represent actual confusion. Somebody who answers that they're not too concerned about nuclear and maybe want their country to support it, and then in the text box has said, I just don't think nuclear energy is the future, something. This is humanity for you. It is a messy thing. But here's another thing. I would occasionally, and this is a vanishing percentage, maybe of 20,000 respondents, a few where I had like a 18-year-old who might have been a PhD or claiming to be PhD educated. And I just honed in on those. With a survey of this size, it will never be absolutely perfect. I'm quite astounded that with such a long survey that ended with an open text box where people got to pour out their thoughts, that we were able to get this quantity of data with such low numbers that had to be thrown out.
Yeah,
Worth
well,
noting, with 1,000 respondents, you can expect statistically the numbers to be there plus or minus 3%. So if you were to run exactly the same poll the next day with a different 1,000, the percentages would be within a tolerance of 3% either way.
very good point, Rich. The fact that we have so many respondents help us round out the outliers. And with that, let's take a look at the result of the polls. You did them in many different countries, and the top countries leaning more towards the yellow side are the more supportive ones. We see China and Russia and the UAE. That's a surprise to me, right at the top, and going down at the bottom. Spain, Brazil, and unfortunately Japan. Tell us a little bit about either of you about how you selected those countries, when those polls were conducted, and what you plan to do in the future.
I'll mention something about country selection, but Rich was more methodical. I came to him and I said, I know you're going to choose some, but I've got some particular itches to scratch. I have visited Philippines a number of times, have been involved in the public debate there. I got to know how Philippines is. Uh, and then I also, of course, the UAE was the host for COP23 or in 2023 for COP28. And we wanted to have the data for the host country at the first public events where we would have access to our full set of data. So Rich was working super hard once he got the data back to get it ready for COP28. And sure enough, we were able to present this work on a global stage at the start of the big nuclear conference that was held. But it was inconceivable that we could leave that out. However, there was something more interesting about the UAE's inclusion. It's not a huge country. It's great that they have a new nuclear program. It's that we had heard in a great level of detail the painstaking effort taken over 10 years to educate almost every single young person in the entire country on the subject of their nation's nuclear program. I don't know if any educational effort like that has ever occurred in nuclear, but arguably, if it had turned out, and it does look pretty good for the UAE here, they have a very new program. Let's see what happens with time. But if that program was successful and representing as did a very small fraction of the budget of establishing the nation's nuclear program, I think that becomes a new model in other countries.
Isn't it ironic that the UAE is actually more pro-nuclear than South Korea, the country where they purchased their nuclear power plants from?
It is ironic. I'll let Rich touch on a few of the other countries here, though.
I'd add, so we wanted to make sure we get all the G7 developed countries, all the BRICS 5 developing countries, and then also that we got the largest 10 nuclear nations. In that largest 10, sadly, we're missing Ukraine. In last year, we weren't able to poll there for obvious reasons. This year, we're very excited because we can poll there. And looking at, there's only one other public opinion survey we've seen on Ukraine, but it seems that public opinion is very supportive of nuclear. So that's going to be interesting to get some fresh numbers on that and compare them to the rest of the countries.
Yeah, and now that you have the baseline, obviously you use the same questions between the different countries so that you can compare them apples to apples. Are you also planning to do them after a while to see how those attitudes change over time?
Yeah, so we're going to run this survey again this year. We might add in a few more countries, so extend from the top 10 largest nuclear to maybe top 15 and a few other strategically interesting countries. Then something that's we're also very excited by is we're running the same survey, but for the US, we're doing state-specific surveys. So we're doing 22 states that in total represent 3/4 of the American population, 3/4 of the nuclear reactors in operation in America. So that's going to be very exciting to see those results, especially in the run-up to the election.
And let me say this, Angelica, you asked,
yes, some definitely we want some predictions from you, Mark. What do you think we're going to find with those?
I am not. The whole point of this webinar is that we don't have to guess, right?
Okay. But
look, okay. Let me allow that in our selection of states, polling is very expensive.
Yes.
We paid for this last year because we thought it would be a very valuable service, and we hoped it would bring people to the table to help support the polling in the future. That turned out to definitely be right. I have to give out a bit of love to the Anthropocene Institute. Thank you so much. Anthropocene already this year has enabled us to add more countries to the global poll, but also to cover more of the US states. And so thank you so much, guys. We'll make sure that if there's crazy findings, you get to hear about them for anybody else. But in terms of keeping the poll going year to year, we absolutely intend to do it. We want to do it. We hope to establish relationships with independent folks in these countries, or I mean, I guess if we're working with governments or nuclear companies that are okay with our releasing of the data publicly, which is the standard we've set for ourselves in this project, then we will be able to expand the footprint of the poll and keep it going over time. That's the dream, that we have a longitudinal survey with maybe new questions coming in, maybe questions that don't seem to have much explanatory power over time. We drop those. We'll have to see it over time. Rich is the poll designer. He'll be the one to talk about that. But I think that if we get that time series and we start being able to track crucial events. So for example, let's get negative. What if there's an assault on Kursk nuclear plant where you have 2 operating Chernobyl-style RBMK reactors right now, this day,
oh, no way.
and that plant gets taken? We've seen pictures come out from passenger trains passing by Kursk nuclear plant of apparently ditches being dug for defense. So who knows what's going to happen to global opinion if something happens there? Is it positive or negative? I don't even think we can know that in advance, because we might not have, if we were able to get this polling before and after the capture of Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and the brief occupation of Chernobyl at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we might have been able to see something there. As it is, we'd like to be able to see global events in our data, good or bad.
Well, you know, Mark, I'm very glad, of course, that the Anthropocene Institute is helping support this very important poll. But it shouldn't be up to us. This should be something that industry really supports, because I feel like it's giving industry the knowledge that it needs to promote itself. And while you say polling is expensive, reactors projects are a lot higher in dollar amounts. And that this brings us to our next topic, which is where nuclear is in danger or being phased out. And those are obviously a hotspot for polling. Here, I'd like to add that Taiwan, I don't think it's too late to be in these slides, but Taiwan was one of the places polled. And actually, through all our discussion of shutting down the nuclear power plant, everybody got so much more educated about nuclear. And let's see if I can trigger the right slide here for the other countries. Yeah, these are the countries that recently shut down nuclear reactors for political reasons. And sometimes you need to lose something before you're able to see its full value, Mark.
So to explain this, what we see is the cost of nuclear is seen as low by more people than the cost of wind or solar in countries that have anti-nuclear policies in place. So Germany, Japan, South Korea, also Taiwan and Sweden. And that's interesting that when when nuclear gets taken away from people, suddenly they appreciate the value that it had and are more supportive of it.
Yeah, well, I can tell you here in Taiwan, because we are fighting, it's a live issue. We just closed our second to last nuclear power plant. There is so much interest about it in the news. And I think even our anti-side might be more educated than people from other places, just because there's just the volume of news is so much greater. But of course, it comes at an enormous cost. And I wonder what's going to happen to Germany in the future as they continue without their nuclear power plants.
Well, Angelica, I'd comment on this. This was another slide that I sat and looked at for some time. It's very hard to see energy costs go down for almost any other reason than canceling very expensive subsidies suddenly, or an electricity price to the public heavily pegged to natural gas or fossil fuel prices, where there's a sudden drop through a recession or something. But even then, utility companies are rightly weary about dropping electricity prices when they know that costs may go back up in the future. And it's much worse for them to raise costs than to, it's much more difficult for them to raise costs than to lower it. So one of the things that we're noticing here is that you had nearly perfect A/B tests in the negative direction for nuclear. You had populations that, like it or not, had nuclear. Then they lost nuclear, experienced a specific price increase when losing nuclear during global events that were raising prices anyway, which nuclear can often cushion the blow of. And then asked directly after that in our polling, how do you feel in the wallet, basically? And what you had is people were forced to know that the same time that people were so proud of shutting off the nuclear plants, the anti-nuclear people were so loudly, famously in the news, as you said, proud of turning off the nuclear plants. At those same times, electricity bills were shooting up. So it made an association in people's heads, perhaps even among people who didn't necessarily want nuclear to continue before or don't support its rebuild.
Well, it's unfortunate. It's great that you captured this information, but as we all know, it's very possible to shut off nuclear power plants quickly. It's not possible to build nuclear power quickly, which is a part of what all this work is about. Let's move on and talk about. Well, I think we got a good sense of what your report is showing, and I encourage everybody to download the full report afterwards. But let's talk a little bit about what we can do with this information and what we talked about stakeholders before, people like investors who might have ESG in mind, industry. We have all this great information. What are the implications?
I'd start off with for policymakers. So as we've seen already, there's a question of support and opposition. We've also asked a question specifically related to policy decisions for governments. Question was, what policy decision do you want to be made on each of these energies, nuclear, wind, solar, etc.? Do you want to build it with subsidies, build it without subsidies, keep using, but don't build any more? Or do you want to get rid of it? And that should inform politicians what their voters want and what the public wants. And what's really interesting in Taiwan, you'll remember the numbers better than me, but from memory, it was something like 80% of Taiwanese wanted to keep using nuclear.
Yes,
and the remainder either didn't know, didn't care, or wanted it phased out. But overwhelmingly, they wanted to keep using it. And that was even in the case of the voters of the political party in power. There was still an overwhelming support for keeping the use of nuclear. So hopefully there's lessons learned for politicians and what they can do. But I think also, if you take a step back, it shows you that political parties, small extremist parties, they don't need many supporters to be able to get into power, get into just the energy department and kill off nuclear. It doesn't, nuclear policies don't necessarily represent the will of the people historically.
Yeah, I have to take off my moderator hat here for just one moment to rant about the situation in Taiwan, which is that, as the PACE poll of Taiwan showed, nuclear energy is tremendously popular, and especially for keeping on the reactors, that's popular across all political parties. The tide has turned within the mind of the public, but there's almost like a dead hand on the levers of policy. So you still have these reactors that's getting turned off, even though people don't want that anymore. And it's extremely frustrating from the point of view of an advocate.
I think I take a brutal, ruthless approach when I'm putting on science. You said moderator hat. When I'm putting on my science hat, and I've just got to know what people think, good, bad, ugly, as I said in my tweet a few minutes promoting this. If I'm thinking like a nuclear advocate, then I'm thinking that there's a number of nuclear phase outs where leaders who themselves are teetering on the edge of popular support and voting for all causes, not just nuclear, are trying to put out an air of inevitability. Like, it is done, it is finished, it is already decided. The people voted for a party that long ago said, we don't like nuclear. How are you going to listen to them now that they're out of power and say they do like nuclear? That is a legitimate gripe. And we've heard it everywhere from Germany to Australia, where parties that didn't support nuclear while in power lost power in a sort of green wave of 2020 to 2023, and then say, actually, we've changed our mind. We're for nuclear now that we have no power to affect a difference. We've seen that. So part of what we want to do is to say, especially in the countries where nuclear is popular, we want to get that information into the public so that there's no air of inevitability argument, or that it's not just the other party that said they like nuclear. It's the public that says they like nuclear, many of whom are voters for the existing anti-nuclear party. I think bridging that information gap is one of our goals in some of the countries that have nuclear phase outs and are included in our polling.
And Sweden has already well on the path of reversal, and we've just got a few more to work on. That's the way I think about it.
I noticed in the Q&A, I know that we're going to go to it, but I couldn't help this because I'm thinking about it. We've had somebody ask about France, saying, how can it be that France has such anti-nuclear attitudes? I'll tell you, one of the worst surprises I got as a young nuclear fan back in 2012, I learned about nuclear, decide to study it, go off to Cambridge. One of the shocking things I learned is almost all the French students I talked to, even like engineering students, and this is a pattern that's been continuous up until very recently, were anti-nuclear. They weren't scared of it. They were just kind of vaguely anti-nuclear. Even more disturbing, a lot of these were from the most elite universities. They could expect to go on to elite business and administrative roles in a still sort of centralized French state. And they were expressing, after their engineering education, totally their whole lives powered by nuclear electricity, basically, they were expressing the exact same weird little thought terminating cliche in their heads. I would ask them, what do you know about nuclear energy in France? They would say, oh, nothing. Then I would say, surely you know that France has nuclear. Oh, of course, I know that France has nuclear. Well, what do you think about it? Well, we had to have nuclear. There was no option before. We had to have nuclear, but now we are switching to ecological energy. So
Vibes,
I heard
basically.
that
Nuclear had
over
bad
and over
vibes.
from several dozen students. So this is, plural of anecdote. Is it data? Sometimes yes. In this case, I found it's been matched by our polling, which indicates that France is more anti-nuclear than you would suspect. And what we know from looking at French polls from not our methodology, not our polling company, but French polls that are more specific. What do you think about nuclear that have been done over time? There was a massive rise in appreciation for the nation's nuclear program after they started tearing down the plants and energy prices got jacked up.
Oh,
So
so
France has
people had
actually
to
been
find out the
extremely
hard way.
anti-nuclear. Yep.
Uh-huh.
And one more thing, if we're mentioning these moments that told us that things were not okay in France, before looking at the fact that Macron, who now ran on a platform of more nuclear, originally ran on a platform of tearing down the nuclear plants. So,
Wow.
like, just to be clear, that was only 2017, 18. Like, it was not that long ago that this leader, who's still the leader of France, popular or not, he got elected claiming he would help tear down nuclear plants. So, right. In 2017, I was in France on a research trip when I worked at Environmental Progress. So we'd gotten a dinner one night with the engineering managers and business managers of Fessenheim nuclear plant, which was due to shut and has now been shut. Then the next day, we were going to meet with the union leaders for lunch, very separate audiences, let's say. So we are meeting with the engineering managers of the plant, and they're saying things like, look, of the top 300 employees at EDF, between the board, upper management, division directors, all the way down, of the top 300, all but 5 are from outside the nuclear part of the company and can be assumed to be anti-nuclear. And I said,
Wow.
first of all, I don't even know how you would get those numbers or how they would make sense. The important things here is that plant directors were willing to share that with random American guests over French wine and cheese as a story, urban legend or not, that represented their feeling of what EDF was as an entity, where 95% of the profits and 90% of the power was coming from nuclear, yet the radical majority of the upper management and the division chiefs were not in support of nuclear. How could you check? I don't know. But again, it was a story that was going around that matched the lived experience of the director of Fessenheim who was telling me this.
I almost wish we could have a pace survey back into the past to track, because I think what we're capturing now is after the vibe shift, right? The vibe shift on nuclear, definitely. I mean, I felt it a lot after Ukraine. Definitely, it accelerated what was already going on, this dawning realization that nuclear is what we need. And so we don't want to wrap up this discussion without the takeaway for our other very important stakeholders, the investors, for the people who, how do we get the money into this industry for this technology now people want, but we have to kickstart everything over again.
Getting nuclear built is hard. An insatiable public demand for nuclear is a great first step. It's going to be easier to get a bigger demand for nuclear among the public and to get the information that the public wants nuclear, for whatever reason, into the minds of their elected officials, or in the countries where that doesn't apply, to make sure that it's clear that the public is supportive of nuclear by whatever means they can express that. Polls maybe, but not elections. So that's something that, I mean, we're not just saying that because we're saying we want people to help us support a broader polling effort so we can truly get all the countries in the world or all the US states, although we would appreciate that. Anybody that would like to support the global polling, we are currently finalizing our list of countries, and if you have a sweet spot you'd like to include for whatever reason, we'd love to talk. However, our goal for this poll is to make sure the industry has a realistic view of what people do and don't think. Sometimes it's not to say to the industry, look, you guys aren't communicating right, these numbers aren't good. Sometimes it's the opposite, saying, these numbers are superb. Where's your confidence? The public appears to have confidence in nuclear. Where's your confidence in the direction of your country? Where's your staffing effort to be ready for answering a nuclear surge? Where's your pushing to include nuclear in green funds and financing? Where's your conversations with other industrial groups and other energy users that have typically not been interested in buying from nuclear plants? Where's your marketing campaign that takes advantage of the public's appreciation for nuclear and meets them where they are? We're only now in the last few weeks, I think, starting to see, at least in America, nuclear companies marketing nuclear energy to end users. It's very new. There's just been a campaign launched in the last couple of days, and it's by a group that specifically called out our poll as a reason to show that the public supported nuclear. So I'm not saying we induced the marketing campaign. What?
Which group?
Constellation.
Wonderful.
So well, this is one of the biggest private operators of power plants globally, and almost all of their power is from nuclear reactors. And their nuclear reactors are in states where they have to compete in the market for electricity. They're not just given guaranteed life by a utility board.
I think for so long, the public and public sentiments have been the enemy of nuclear power. It might take companies and other stakeholders a minute to realize that they're now a very winnable group of folks to get on our side. So, and the PACE polls are definitely a very valuable part of that educational effort. Rich, I'm going to let you have the last word here. Since
on the point you just made, early on, you had the chart of support versus opposition. And we see around the world, there's 1.5 times more support than opposition. On your point around sort of strong feelings and, you know, the backlash there might be, what was interesting to see is strong support was 2 times bigger than strong opposition. And in many countries, it was even more so. Like you can see in China, strong support was about 5-10 times bigger than strong opposition. And what that sort of strong emotion really tells us is those are the people that are willing to go out and fight for nuclear or fight against it. And in countries where strong support massively outweighs strong opposition, the nuclear industry can have that self-confidence. It's not going to get the public backlash that it's had in the past that it fears.
Yeah, and it also shows us the warning, the spots where nuclear is not doing well. Very concerned about Brazil being so low here, as it's going to be hosting COP, and also Japan, a very strong potential nuclear country. And yes, we should wrap it up because we also need to leave some time for our Q&A. So I want to thank Rich and Mark very much and have them stay on the line. I'm going to get rid of this. And let's look in our chat room for the Q&A section.
And I'm sorry, I've been answering some that I could probably address live. I've just been asked, probably because I mentioned Constellation and somebody brought it up. Somebody asked about the profit sharing agreement for Chicago area ratepayers that kept nuclear plants online instead of closing them 3 years ago. So in brief, nuclear plants were hitting the end of a brutal downward spiral of revenue. There were biggest companies in the world parking their businesses near and around nuclear plants.
Mark, which question are you answering?
This is asking about Constellation's agreement.
Okay.
profit sharing agreement for Chicago. What's so interesting is that this took place in a total vacuum of public information about nuclear and an almost total vacuum about publicly marketing nuclear. Chicago is a city of about 6 to 8 million people in the surrounding area. It's about 100% nuclear power, all from 11 reactors owned by the same company. Very weird situation.
Mark, this website is going to, webcast is going to be recorded and played for people who can't see the question and answer. So I'm going to read out the questions before you answer, okay? Okay, this is from Carl Wirtz. As might be expected, it seems understanding of nuclear's lack of carbon emission in a country is highly correlated with its adaptation there. That seems to be more of a comment. Barry Grant Marsh question. My company has patented a technology that has nuclear waste remediation as its goals. Do you think this technology would change the attitude of support for nuclear energy? Does that come up a lot, the issue of waste, you guys?
Constantly.
Yeah, it's similar to safety concerns. Around the world, is roughly 80% of the public is concerned about the waste. Next year, we look forward to polling, or this year, look forward to polling Finland, where they've got their deep geological repository. But in our existing data, we've got data on France, where they recycle a lot of their waste. And what's interesting there, where they're putting billions into closing off their fuel cycle, their public concern about nuclear waste is the same as everywhere else. And you speak to the people at Orano and you ask them, why are you putting billions in when few other countries do this? And they say it's public perception. But as far as the polling suggests, there's not much difference. It's not money well spent at removing public fear of nuclear waste.
Interesting. Well, we look forward to seeing the results from Finland next year. We have a couple of comments here from Carl Page. Energy industry love the casino business where prices fluctuate for reasons that they can't be blamed for. Has Taiwan explored how much gas could cost after a couple of ships get blown up by a tiny terrorist group like the Houthis? I am afraid that is something we haven't even begun to talk about.
And I'll say that although you might say they like it like a casino business, energy producers don't like downside risk. They want upside risk, but cap downside. And midstream people, they want differences in prices between two different places. The downstream people want prices that are anyway. So you mentioned it was like the casino business. I think casino businesses have a much more regular, reliable edge. If anything, I'll say that the parties that are most interesting and informative for me to talk to, but whose sector I trust the least, are those who are energy traders on a market like electricity that does not have deliverability like a real commodity. So this is a bunch of crazy stuff, and it's not exactly polling, but I'll just say, because you asked Carl, we set up electricity markets that fluctuate crazier than any other commodity on planet Earth, in part because they're not commodity. Electricity is not fungible place to place, time to time. It is effectively zero storage capacity. And where we do have storage, that's only in very specific geometries of wires and cities where the power needs to flow both to be stored and to be exchanged. What drives me nuts is that we built a system that's much easier for traders to game or exploit than to engineer. So you have this very weird situation where traders can play a casino game where they effectively are a lot closer to the operator rather than the user, the end user of the casino. But yeah, point well taken. It's a problem. One of the things that we do have control over, I think, in our world of advocates is, are we reaching the public on nuclear energy? We do have control over that, even if we don't have control over things like the control of a rebel group of the Straits of Hormuz where so much natural gas passes through.
Well, there you go, folks. You heard it from Mark Nelson. Energy markets, crazier than a casino.
There's another question I've seen from Carl that I want to address. So
yes,
makes the point.
Can you read out the question first before you answer it?
He makes the point that the fossil fuel industry spends $200 billion a year on marketing and influencing. And that's about 5% of revenue. And why doesn't the nuclear industry do the same? And Mark and I have had this discussion with the industry. We're at a working group, and the feeling is the focus very much is about safety in the industry. Maybe it's 5% of their revenues they spend on safety. And safety is important to the industry. If you look at Japan, they had a safety incident, it all shut down. But what we told everyone was safety isn't life or death for the nuclear industry. The three countries where there have been the biggest nuclear disasters, 3 Mile Island in the US, Chernobyl in Ukraine, Fukushima in Japan, those three countries are still all using nuclear. What's much worse for the industry isn't a safety disaster, but a public support disaster. You look at Germany, you're looking at Spain, Taiwan. In those countries, there wasn't the investment in speaking to the public, and therefore those industries have all suffered. We feel that the industry needs to think as seriously about public support and maintaining it for the long term as safety, and again, maintaining that for the long term.
Absolutely. You can't solve a public relations problem with more engineering. And I fear safety in nuclear. It's not that it's not safe, it's that the public doesn't think of it that way.
Can I push back a tiny bit and say that I bounced back from different times. I got into nuclear saying, here's engineering we need to do to solve the public perception issue. I've then swung all the way over to, it is only public, it is only spiritual. We need priests and psychologists to get to the bottom of this. I'm starting to come around to a set of hybrid views. For example, I don't think we need Yucca Mountain. I know different people are going to disagree. That's my personal view as a nuclear engineer and as somebody who speaks to a lot of the public, okay? When I go and look at a facility like the one in Finland, where it's deep waste repositories designed for 1,000,000, billion, trillion years, it's this permanence, yet they still have to have retrievability. It's, I'm glad they built it, and I'm glad they had the public acceptance to build it. And I think we're going to see that the public is starting to relax about nuclear. I think there's room for a hybrid approach where countries can make an agreement with Finland to get either advice and support to do a similar facility in their own country, or even get permission from the Finnish people to pay the Finnish people in the future, should they want to make the Finnish repository a location for some of their spent fuel. Then you have a situation where a facility that I don't think you had to build for engineering and safety reasons, that did get built, could be useful as a physical facility to guarantee nuclear waste. That is then an important part of the public message around having a solution for the waste, even if it's in Finland as opposed to in your home country. So that's a hybrid solution where it's a public opinion based on at least a first breakthrough facility offering an engineering response to a psychological need.
I think just having the Finnish repository even before it's finished has actually helped things already, because you can point to the fact that actually there is a solution.
Angelica, it's been weirder than that for me. I've been recognized at the convenience stores by my apartment building here in Chicago by clerks who say, hey, bro, do you post about nuclear on Reddit? And I say, I have to admit, I've never been on Reddit. And they're like, bro, is this you? And it's like the video of me at the museum built to show off the Finnish nuclear waste repository, doing a video because I wasn't able to visit the real thing. So not only did I make a video about the Finnish waste repository without going to the physical thing. Now, it was only possible because they were building it. So I'm not saying you can't build some facilities, but I make the video, and then the video goes viral on multiple different platforms. And then I get recognized in Chicago for saying that nuclear waste is okay. We have it solved, even though they haven't started loading the fuel in the facility in Finland. So if you were just speculating, Angelica, I think you speculated well, because that is exactly what we've seen so far.
You provided the spiritual solution to the nuclear waste problem.
Exactly what they train us to do in engineering school.
I'm going to have to quickly go through the rest of these and pick, unfortunately. Michael McLean says, who else tracks nuclear opinions? Quick answers now. Do we have any more time series polling from Pew Research?
Eurobarometer tracks it, albeit, and that's the EU, albeit I find their poll a bit biased in that the question is, do you support nuclear if it's safe and clean? And
so it's a bit of that push poll.
Yeah. Otherwise, Anne Visconti does an excellent job of public opinion polling in the US and has got longitudinal data there. Those are the main two ones I've seen.
Wonderful. Well, looking forward to the future polling from you guys to see how opinions change over time. By the way, Dennis Rodriguez asked, is your group expecting to expand the study into Latin America, more countries in Latin America?
We'd love to. It's a little bit difficult because the criteria that Rich laid down only really covered Brazil among the countries, and Brazil remains very important to us because it's the next host. We are looking for people who can help us expand to areas we currently aren't covering and currently can't justify based on our budget. We would like to have Mexico. It's a nuclear country. It'll give us a total North America panorama. We would love to have some of the countries that I've heard the most noise thinking about nuclear. For example, Argentina's got a nuclear program. It'd be great to have them, especially with the new president that we don't know his views on nuclear. We know his views on not having government spending, which supported the nuclear program. What's
So
going
on
to come? We
average,
don't
how
know,
much
but
does it cost to poll per country? 1K people, how much does it cost? Izuru wants to know.
it depends on the country. DM us and we'll tell you about our experience, especially with this year. It's different prices.
Can we say more about the BRICS in general? Arvind is asking about India and BRICS. Any insights jumping out at you there? It seems like Indians
The big
think
one for
that
me in
India has
India
high
is
emission. They'll
is the
support it
gender
quite
gap.
strongly. The gender
In
gap. Oh,
in
yes.
in India, there's a very small, almost non-existent gender gap in public support. Men and women support nuclear as much as each other.
There's
And
nowhere else on earth we found quite has that level of gender equality on support for nuclear. It is shocking to me. It's been backed up since we did this polling by anecdotal evidence. A lot of the young climate warriors that I've met at COP and afterwards from India are young women who love nuclear. It's
Wow.
not something I've seen to be true in a lot of other places.
Yeah, because in a lot of other places where the general result is quite pro-nuclear, you nevertheless still see a wide gender gap. What are some of those wide gender gap countries you can think of?
Well, Russia has very high support for nuclear, supported by overwhelming support among men and mediocre soft support among women. There's an example.
the other big gender gaps are Norway, Belgium, Australia, and the UK. I think, Norway and Australia, those countries, they don't have nuclear energy, and therefore it's not talked about as much. And therefore, maybe, men have found the weird corners of Reddit that speak about it, but women aren't in those forums yet. So that might explain why the sort of new to nuclear nations have that gender gap. With Belgium and the UK, I think the other gap we see for those countries is views on nuclear support, depending on whether people are members of environmental organizations. So in Belgium, members of environmental organizations are much less likely to support nuclear than those not. And that's not always the case. Not every country is like that. In the US, it's actually the opposite, that members of environmental organizations are slightly more supportive. But in Belgium, that seems to be an overwhelming anti for nuclear.
That is fascinating, and it goes to show, it really demonstrates, Rich, the value of this PACE survey, because the amount of granularity, the amount of crosstabs that you can get into if you're an activist in one of those countries, the rich seam of information that's available, if you dig into those reports, is just incredible. As a nuclear activist, I think you guys are doing fantastic work, and I hope that it expands in the future to more countries and over time, so that we have the truth, and that will ultimately be the best tool for us to continue our nuclear journey. All right, this brings us to the end of our webcast.
Can I just say, if
Yes.
anyone who asked a question that we didn't get to, definitely feel free to reach out to us.
Definitely.
And even after the recording is done, Angelica, we'll leave it up to you. I would be willing to stick around and help.
Let's do it. But first of all, just for the webcast, I'd like to thank you guys very much and ask you for any wrap-up comments. And as you guys can see, Mark and Rich's contact details are on the screen for you guys to get in touch. Final words, gentlemen.
I'll start.
I'm gonna go first because this is Rich's survey and I want to let him speak last. And I'm gonna do it by addressing a thought-provoking thing that I've gotten from Zach. So Zach Van Horn asked the question, how did Radiant change its advocacy based on this survey? So first of all, Radiant doesn't advocate. They do polling, and if it comes out it's bad for nuclear, that's what we do. That's our consulting business, and we're fairly strict professionals about it. Now, I don't tweet for pay. I tweet for me, and I was tweeting for me as long back as I've had Twitter. How I've changed my personal approach based on the polling is to be way more open-minded and let other people spend a lot more time expressing their own interest. I know this classic, yeah, maybe I was just mansplaining at parties my whole life. I'm so deeply curious about what people think and how they think of it now that I've seen this infinite variety, this huge rainbow of opinions from around the world, coupled with this voice box. We've given people the chance to write us a message, and we got 20,000 messages. I have an insatiable need to hear people's opinions as if they were one of our 20,000 that we would have maybe gotten to poll in person if we'd had a budget to run studies like that in countries. So, Zach, the answer to your question is, for me as an advocate, I want to hear people's responses, ask them a bunch of questions, and then try to understand where they would have fit in our data. And that acts as a feedback for understanding how to work with our polling.
Great. And Rich, wrap it up.
My final words.
And if you can include something about ESG and how nuclear might belong there, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, well, just briefly on ESG, we asked the public whether they would prioritize funding putting their money in an ESG fund that explicitly includes nuclear or one that explicitly excludes nuclear. Because our understanding is that a lot of ESG funds out there don't include nuclear because of fear of public backlash. But what we find is in most countries, there's just as many people that are going to prioritize the ESG fund with nuclear than prioritize the one without it. So actually, the backlash is on both sides. You're never going to make everyone happy, but if you want to sort of tap into a untapped side of the market, then take a stance. Obviously, there's also a large majority, 50% or 60%, that don't really care whether nuclear is in their ESG fund or not. My final words, though, were just about the COP28 pledge. So monumental pledge to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. Biggest sort of ambition in the nuclear industry globally in my lifetime. And what's great to see in the public data is that ambition is very much supported around the world. Around the world, more than 2 times more people want to build more nuclear, often with subsidies, than to get rid of it. And therefore, that COP pledge is backed up by public support.
Wow, well said. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, I'm Angelica Ong with the Anthropocene Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for this webcast, and we look forward to bringing you many more in the future.